The South. We all want to be there. It's an ideal. It draws us to it. It's a mythical place. To Britons today, the South is exuberant vines, guiltless hedonism, excitable olives, the immemorial ruins of immemorial civilizations, primary coloured emotions. It's a promised land and a rolled supermodel. Our wine is from the South. We eat the South's food. We vertically tan to look southern. Oranges do come from the South. Our architects are going to remake rundown Yorkshire towns as Tuscan hill villages because Britain and Italy share a common culture and a common climate. The South causes the North to suffer a collective delusion about itself. We deny our northernness.
We deny it to such an extent that we're unfamiliar with those countries which share our climate. They might remind us of ourselves, for they too are engaged in a perpetual battle denying their northernness. To be northern is to be forever ill at ease with oneself. Why ever would anyone go north? Out of curiosity. Exoticism may not depend exclusively on ouzo and olives. And if the north, like the south, is more than a cardinal point of the compass, where is it? Where does it start?
Je croyais voir le ciel bleu. J'apprenais mes leçons, la joue contre son bras. Je crois qu'il était fier de moi. Il était généreux comme ceux du pays. Et je lui dois ce que je suis. Au nord, c'était les corons. La terre, c'était le charbon. Le ciel, c'était l'horizon. Les hommes, des mineurs de fond. Le ciel, c'était l'horizon. Les hommes, des mineurs de fond.
Late Pierre Bachelet's sentimental anthem tells us that slag heaps are to the north what sybaritism is to the south. It also tells us that this is where the north begins, here in the département of France called boldly Nord.
The north starts here, in Flanders, in the tapestry town of Arras, which gave its name to the kind of screen Polonius was behind when he suffered his unfortunate accident.
I first came here the first time I travelled to Italy. Nothing I subsequently saw in Pienza or San Gimignano or Siena impressed me the way that these great squares did. There was obviously something wrong with me, the man who preferred the Flemish to the Florentine, who still prefers it.
In 1500, Arras had a population of less than 10,000, yet it built these great urban squares and a splendid town hall. When excavations are made in Flanders for roads and railways, the bones of men slaughtered in the First World War constitute the first stratum that diggers encounter. Further down are multitudinous herring skeletons.
The people of Arras ate between 2 and 3 million herrings per year. That's 200 to 300 for every person. They were faithful to the staple, but then they had no choice. That's what a staple means. But what a staple? This supposedly humble fish, which is actually infinitely preferable to lobster or sole, has incited great ingenuity in humans. Our forebears have smoked it in countless ways, sweet cured it, sour cured it, soused it in gin, soused it in vinegar, eaten it raw, buried it, fermented it.
Herring is still a staple, eaten north of here for more than 1,000 miles. From Flanders to the furthest shores of the Baltic, there exists a uniformity as distinctive as that of the Mediterranean. A uniformity which is much more than gastronomic, a uniformity fractured by neighbourly murderousness down the centuries, but which remains manifest in architecture, in art, in food and in drink, in schnapps and beer. The north is as much an ideal as the south. It's the unpromised land of darkness, of the Gothic in all its forms, of thrilling grimness, exhilarating harshness, inky canals, fog, glistening cobbles, of buildings that respond to flatlands and vast skies with spires, fantastical roof lines, wild gables, pointed arches, and slag heaps, which man made to compensate for the lack of mountains.
In Geneva alsjeblieft. Northern art has, down the centuries, shunned broad brush marks in favour of minute detail.
It revels in the grotesque and the discomforting. It's born out of disgust at our bodies, despair at our mores. The northern spirit is one of baleful neurosis, grinning cynicism and gleeful misanthropy. It's excited by bleak deformities. It is characterized by existential gloom.
It relishes horrible laughter, fear, mockery, joyless perversity rather than the pursuit of happiness. It's not immune to beauty, but its idea of beauty is far from classical. It's jagged. As I say, the North is seldom at ease with itself. Southern Europeans hold their liquor and shun mass drunkenness. That, anyway, is the myth. There is a corresponding myth about Northern Europeans. They escape from themselves by drinking for oblivion and then by suicide. That is, if cirrhosis hasn't got them first. Neither proposition is strictly accurate, but we tend to believe the latter because we know so little of the North.
Beer is to the north what woods are to bears, a sensual necessity. Wine's primacy is vanquished. The flatlands are a borderland because they occupy latitudes where vines cease to be productive. The weather's not up to it.
Tous ces bières, il y en a combien?
Un peu plus que 400.
400?
Oui.
Faites semblant que vous êtes condamné à mort.
Oui.
Une bière avant de mourir.
Alors, pour moi, une bière, la dernière avant de mourir, je pense que ce serait la Carolus van de Keyser. C'est une bière assez magnifique, qui est assez rare. Une bière qui est brassée une fois dans l'année et qui a beaucoup de saveurs assez puissantes, qui serait parfaite pour les derniers instants. Voilà.
The beers brewed in northern France and Belgium give lie to the idea that the drink is simply an agent of oblivion. though presumably dropsic or medieval monks subject to a vow of silence did often drink as much as 12 pints a day. Beer is also delicious and varied. Saffron beer, licorice beer, honey beer, apple beer, chestnut beer, beer that tastes like Varol. Beer's comparatively lowly status may be due to its being predominantly a drink of the north, which does not carry the cliched connotations of sun and sybaritism attached to wine.
There is another drink that the north can't get along without. Distilled grain goes under many names: Mother's Ruin, Vera Lynn. In French Flanders, it's known as Oul, after what was a single industry village, 200 people, 6 distilleries. Corren, Wayne and Pequet are other names. The most common is Genièvre, after the French for juniper, which is the most popular flavouring agent. The word is not that far from Genever, which is used in half of Belgium and all of Holland. Genever was abbreviated in English to gin. In London, gin was also known as Hollands.
It had been introduced with the monarchy's restoration in 1660. Charles II had spent much of his exile in Holland. It wasn't just gin that Britain owed to the Low Countries. There was Dutch courage, there was William of Orange. There was also the quiet, harmonious, immediately post-Gothic architectural style that Britain copied from such towns as Middelburg.
Gin was to that era what crack and smack are to our own. The difference was that it was a coveted source of revenue. It was said of the United Provinces' inhabitants that they hate their states, yet love their liquor and pay excise. Rather like Britain today. Any shrewd exchequer knows that the appetite for liquor will always overcome prudence.
Fruits such as grapes ferment naturally, cereals don't. So malting was arrived at as the means to stimulate fermentation in cereals because intoxication is an elemental human need, a need that increases as the climate becomes hostile towards cultivation, whilst at the same time demanding to be countered by dreams, by walls of blankness. Thus, where the need is greatest, there are the fewest means of satisfying it. Where the living isn't easy, higher levels of resourcefulness are required to create the chemical illusion of ease, which is a vital compensation.
Ingenuity exists, or should exist, in direct proportion to a landscape's hostility and a climate's severity. Zeeland is well named, sea, land, neither land nor sea. Land which once was sea, land which is forever threatened by the sea and may become sea again. The reclamation of land from sea, and beyond that, the creation of land where there was none, are testimonies to Dutch ingenuity. This is a country whose most basic fabric is man-made. This is not the natural world. It is the unnatural world. Nature has been defeated and man has for the time being at least triumphed. And because he has triumphed, he feels at liberty to take diabolical liberties.
The great painters of the northern tradition, Van der Weyden and Van Eyck, Bosch and Boot, never allow their subjects, which are sometimes religious, to occlude their worldliness. This tradition continues today. The pietism of their subject matter is undermined by high artifice. The aesthetic austerities and the humility of the South are nowhere to be seen. Sacred art in the North does not dissemble technique, flair, brio. The painter is omnipresent, never letting you forget that all this is achieved through human skill. According to Bosch, heaven is a dogger's paradise, a celestial car park rendezvous. And so too is hell, the difference being that pigs are dressed as nuns. The artist is more interested in inventing than in preaching. But what if Bosch was wrong? What if all this corrupting flesh is just so much wishful thinking, and both heaven and hell are car parks where no one turns up, where you're alone forever? Just as the North's native drinks are beer and distilled grain, so is its true architecture the Gothic. The Gothic is indigenous. It starts where vines stop, which may of course be completely by chance. The cathedrals of Saint-Denis, Laon, Saint-Quentin, Soissons, Reims, Coutances, and this one at Amiens are not merely remarkable structures. They provided the template for countless others. They created the architectural idiom that in its various guises would dominate Northern Europe for 400 years, from the 1200s to the 1600s. The Gothic spread north like an architectonic pandemic. The North and Gothic architecture would become indissolubly bound to each other. In the North, the Gothic was the norm. Indeed, the Gothic outlived the Gothic age. It never went away, and it never will. Northern religious architecture is, of course, made to the glory of God. It creates spaces where mankind can abase itself before an imported spiritual idea. Yet this sacred architecture, like contemporary painting, is just as concerned with a markedly earthbound showing off. Of course, sumptuous carving and abundant sculpture signify civic might, a town's pride and wealth, but they also boast about the craftsman's prowess. There is a paradox here. The human maker's omnipresence is apparent in Gothic in a way that it is not in classical structures. But it is classical structures which are, notionally, founded in proportions derived from the human body. Gothic architecture is akin to Shakespeare's art, sublime and vulgar, monstrous and tender. It steals from everywhere. The Gothic is not underpinned by an intellectual formula, least of all by an abstraction that precedes the work, a generic rulebook. Man does not base the Gothic upon his measurable body, but upon what occurs in his immeasurable mind and imagination. The Gothic was fluid. It encouraged invention. Tyrants and autocrats have seldom espoused it because it does not represent order. It represents rather individuality and originality. Gothic buildings evidently acknowledge their precursors, but they don't copy them. Gothic was, in its way, progressive, always seeking to improve, or at least to be different. This consensus over long centuries and great distances was merely architectural, nothing more. Architecture can be a bond, but not here. Here it was a mask which disguised schisms. It papered over the northern post-Reformation appetite for ever-dividing communions, communions whose dogmatic differences seem mere hair-splitting to the outsider. Such factionalism was mocked in the 1650s by Andrew Marvell. Sure, when religion did itself embark and from the east would westward steer its arc, it struck, and splitting on this unknown ground, each one thence pillaged the first piece he found. Hence Amsterdam, Turk, Christian, pagan, Jew, staple of sects and mince of schism grew. That bank of conscience where not one so strange opinion but finds credit and exchange. Edam.
There is a Dutch saying that when 3 people meet, they form a sect, and when a 4th joins, the sect splits in 2 over doctrinal differences. This is the one and true cheese. These are apostate cheeses because they are flavoured with caraway and with cloves. And this is the cheese of heretics because it is flavoured with pepper. May they sneeze in hell.
Numerous mutually tolerant confessions coexisted in the early 1600s. This coexistence was encouraged by those whose enduring god was money, for they stood to gain from it. A merchant guild or fellowship whose members are of different faiths and cultures is less restricted in whom it can do business with than one which is uniformly composed.
Sectarianism diminishes religion's temporal power. Countless diverging sects cannot exercise the sort of control that a single church can. Religion then ceases to dominate the everyday. It becomes what you might call a faith-style choice, an add-on. The North is where religion began to grow up, began to self-secularize.
The first graphic step in that process was iconoclasm, stripping churches of idolatrous images which are no more than jujus. The resultant post-Reformation church interiors, bereft of amulets, were the invariable subject of the paintings made in the first half of the 1600s by the Haarlem master Pieter Sanredom. The extent of their secularization is made obvious. Churches had become public parks with a roof. You might amble, converse, hang out, lie around, visit as a tourist, or make paintings of them. Sanredom's paintings are spellbinding in their stillness, lack of incident, lack of all but a few isolated individuals who are engaged in anything but worship. All Sanredom took from van der Weyden, let alone Bosch, was an obsession with meticulous detail. Otherwise, he's cold, dispassionate, objective. He invented an art of self-proclaiming understatement. It appears worryingly bland, stubbornly mute. Nothing happens, in a most emphatic way, yet the very absences provoke foreboding and discomfiture. They persuade the spectator to wonder what is not being shown. They imply an unspoken mystery, a metaphysical mystery, not a transcendental mystery.
He talks quietly and subtly about the sheer marvellousness of human life, human sensibility, human ingenuity. Sanredom's achievement was peculiar, and it was for centuries unacknowledged. It was not till the 20th century, till the advent of the machine age, that his austerity and blankness rang a bell. His detachedness became a northern norm, so widely emulated that there is, effectively, a continuous school of Sanredom, self-consciously glacial, non-committal, and as pregnant with possibility as those churches where something may or may not be about to happen, something terrible.
His bleakly humanistic example is discernible in the work of a school of painters who are hardly known in Britain because Britain looked south, gave slavering forelock to the broad brush marks of Mediterranean satyrs. So northern painters such as the Dutchman Karel Willink and the Weimar Republic artists Richard Oelzer, Christian Schad, Franz Radziwiłł are absurdly overlooked, and so too are their current peers, no matter how brilliant they may be.
My name is Annemarie Buschers, painter. I live and work in Groningen.
Who is it?
My husband Thomas.
And How many portraits have you made of him?
3.
Mein Name ist Manfred Jürgens, ich bin Maler und Fotograf.
There's no greater dockscape in Northern Europe than Hamburg's. International trade required a common language. When the globe was not yet a globe, when you could still fall off the edge, the lingua franca spoken from Flanders as far as the easternmost Baltic was Plattdeutsch, the German of the coastal flatlands of the still flat world. This pigeon of convenience was picked up in taverns and prisons and brothels. There is no greater brothel in Northern Europe than Hamburg. The northern way of selling sex is to do it with a sort of candour. The sex shops and massage parlours, the strip clubs and hostess bars might be selling computers or fan belts. They're far from furtive. This building behind me houses the monument to the unknown pimp. Societies which tolerate and even honour prostitution do not prosecute genocidal programmes. It's a characteristic of societies which do prosecute such programmes that they should have a prudish horror of sexual sleaze. Ethnic cleansers are moral cleansers. It was not the Weimar Republic which exterminated millions of innocents, but the Third Reich, which also declared the great Weimar painters to be decadent. Hamburg is tolerant of the sex industry, not merely, however, because it is impossible to suppress. The sex industry is industry, trade, commerce. I have it on good authority that it has the ultra gold seal of approval from the only god who counts round here, Mammon. Look at the number plate on this car. Actually, it's not a car, it's a boast about wealth. HH stands for Hansestadt Hamburg. Hamburg was a member of the Hanse, the Hanseatic League, centuries before Germany existed. And Hamburg's identity, its sense of itself, is much more tied to that mercantile alliance, God's first attempt at the EU, than it is to Germany. Actually, this is not Germany, this is Hanseland. More than half a millennium has elapsed since the Hanseatic League dissipated. Yet Hanse cities have continued to define themselves as belonging to that confederation of the distant past and to the Baltic, rather than to Germany, Bismarck's comparatively recent creation, which has defined itself by means other than trade. Hanse cities have seldom lost sight of their architectural past. Expressionism was a variety of modernism, the variety which didn't prevail against the rectilinear idiom of the international style. The fact that Expressionism is peculiar to the North indicates its indebtedness to a specific architecture. Far from trying to break with the past like the international style, Expressionism embraced it. It reworked local practice. This is the only way in which Hansestadt Hamburg is parochial. It's Germany's most cosmopolitan city. No doubt because as one of the world's largest ports, it's open to everything and everyone. One night a few years after reunification, a minicab driver pointed out to me a bedraggled group of men outside a railway station. Aussies, he said, from the east. They come over here and they take our jobs. He then exhibited his commitment to the reconciliation between the two Germanys, his acknowledgement of how Germany is treated by moron British papers, and his fabulous sense of humour by turning to me and saying, "Know what we should do with them? We should gas them." Well, that was in Munich. I think it's unlikely that a Hamburg minicab driver would behave in the same way. Or rather, I like to think it's unlikely. There is no truth, incidentally, absolutely no truth, in the rumour that ABBA were two minicab drivers from Hamburg and their porn star wives. The Hansa traded. It pursued wealth, a pursuit that ceases to be mere greed if it's divinely sanctioned, and if a proportion of that wealth can be spent appeasing God by building churches to his glory, then God will in turn offer protection to sailors, will put wind in merchantmen's sails, will assure abundant harvests on land and at sea, and will, of course, ease the way to heaven. The Scottish sceptic David Hume noted of gamesters and of sailors, "Of all mankind they are the least capable of serious reflection, though they most abound in frivolous and superstitious apprehensions." And because religious observance is the insurance policy of the gamester, that is the chancer, the mercantile wide boy, such entrepreneurs clothe their meeting places in sacred garb, just to be on the safe side. Guild halls and cloth halls imitated churches. Wealthy burghs built town halls that are like giant shrines, outsized versions of the richest tombs and chantries that constellate cathedrals. Merchants are commemorated by statues. Mere builders, however, are commemorated by gargoyles, which derives from the French for gurgle, gugui, an onomatopoeia, gugui, gugui, gugui. It's a hoddie's fate to become a waterspout. Not being subject to dogma, secular buildings weren't obliged to deprive themselves of frenetic ornament when iconoclasm became the rage in churches. As is so often the case, clerical zealots were out of step with their congregations, who yearned as ever for ornament as the physical manifestation of the supernatural, just as they yearned for theatrical ritual. So the taste for ornament came to be satisfied in secular settings, which is not to say that the ornaments were ornaments for their own sake, that they were meaningless. These outsized maquettes of vessels are slung from the beams of the Schiefergesellschaft House, the former hall of the Association of Skippers in Hansestadt Lübeck. They're evidently emblems of a profession. They're also good luck charms, which are more use at protecting man from hostile elements than equally exquisite representations of saints. They fulfill the same superstitious need, but they were also teaching aids, used to instruct tyro sailors. On top of that, they're decorative. This dish is called labskaus. The version here comprises beef and potato hash with salted cucumber and beetroot. It's a means of making a little meat go a long way. To style it a dish is to undersell it. It's history on a plate. More often than not, the meat would be corned beef, not the delicacy in a tin that caused the 1964 Aberdeen typhoid outbreak, but corned beef meaning simply salt beef. A corn is a granule of salt. Salt was a prized and valuable commodity. By the 15th century, 4 vessels a week would ply between the salt pans of the French Atlantic coast and the Baltic. It was a means of preserving meat and fish and vegetables. Germany without potatoes is as unimaginable as the repetitively offending suicide bomber.
Labskaus, however, predates the introduction of the potato to Europe from South America in the 1500s. Till then, the meat had been mixed with root vegetables.
That was the version that was taken to Liverpool by Baltic sailors or by Liverpudlian sailors returning home. There have, of course, been other exchanges between Liverpool and northern Germany. Liverpool transformed Labskaus into something close to Lancashire hot pot, but the name hardly changed.
It became naturalised as lobscouse. It was so widely eaten that the inhabitants of that independent city-state acquired its name. Whether they adopted it willingly or were given it mockingly as a jibe is moot. But scouse stuck.
This rare instance of a people being called after what it supposedly eats is a vernacular version of the literary device called metonymy. The name scouse is ultimately due to trade. Wood, fur, wool, pitch, amber, meat, wine, salt, grain, herring, schnapps. These were firstly commodities which, by fulfilling needs and sating appetites, created the North's wealth. Wealth is as here today, gone tomorrow as any politician, any herring, any side of beef. Commodities themselves may not endure, but their transport is the cause of cultural, linguistic, gastronomic, architectural and artistic migrations. It's through these migrations that trade's legacy comes down to us. The traditional cheese of Bordeaux, for instance, was till very recently Dutch, Edam or Gouda. Such exchanges are not necessarily partial or fair. Even in an association of supposed equals, one partner will be dominant. For about 300 years, from 1250 to 1550, Lübeck was the capital of Northern Europe. A de facto capital, that is. Officially, it was just one of many city-states. But its mercantile power was unmatched. And that power is graphically demonstrated in the city itself.
The early years of its preeminence coincided with the arrival of the Gothic from northern France. The template had evidently been altered en route. This is the idiom arrived at in Lübeck's diocesan cathedral. It's vast, it's magnificent, but it was built on the periphery of the city.
The contemporary city church, the Marienkirche, is equally vast, equally magnificent. And it's central. It's attached to the town hall. It was one of 6 such churches built by wealthy merchants. It might be a sacred structure, but it's not entirely useless. The other 6 days of the week it was used as a corn exchange and as a market. It showed where the power in Lübeck resided, and it did not reside with the cathedral and with the bishop.
Merchants also built dwellings for themselves and for their employees, and docks, and almshouses and warehouses, prisons, fortresses. Brick and stepped gables, crow-step gables, are everywhere. Brick, because there was little building stone that would withstand the weather, and decorative gables because one day a mason thought of it, others liked the result, and it caught on. It crossed the seas. A shaped gable has no structural purpose. Its purpose is to appeal to the eye, to make a grand silhouette against the northern sky, to allow both patron and craftsman to show off.
It is then purely ornamental. It was occasionally used in such buildings as warehouses and fortresses. It was frequently used in houses, which were also workplaces. It's associated with brick architecture, but it's not peculiar to it. Think of the similar gables fashioned from Hull and granite in the east of Scotland.
Brick is pliable, versatile. It does not constrain the designers who use it. Their decisions are aesthetically based. So the predominant characteristics of northern architecture are deliberately willed. Precise, lugubrious, stern, morbidly fantastical, exhilaratingly gloomy, pompous, worldly, industrious. These qualities are not the products of chance. They indicate how the North projected and glorified itself, how it saw itself, has continuously seen itself, still sees itself.
Lübeck's mercantile power was translated into legal power. Hansa cities adopted Lübeck law. It was also translated into aesthetic power. And Lübeck's language, Plattdeutsch, the German of the flat coastal plains, became the lingua franca of the Hansa. The Hansa lasted 300 years, as long as the British Empire, longer than the French Empire, longer than the Belgian Empire, longer than the Soviet Empire, much longer than the 12 years of the Thousand-Year Reich. Both those tyrannies occupied Hansa territories and built prolifically. Yet their architectural legacy does not begin to compare with that of the Hansa, neither in terms of beauty, which is obvious, nor in terms of sheer quantity.
These cities possess an identity that is collective and corporatist. They affected globalization when the globe was not yet a globe. They wear an imperial uniform.
Despite having created a homogeneous culture, the Hansa is overlooked as an empire because it was rooted in trade rather than in the desire to impose a toxic religion or noxious ideology on people who didn't want it. It wasn't in the business of coercion, it wasn't in the business of capturing hearts and minds. The only parts of the body that interested it were the pocket and the purse.
Its only significant belief was in the creation of wealth and the communal benefits that derived from wealth. There were no murderous emperors, no tin-pot caliphs, no lethal autocrats, no self-aggrandizing prefects setting the world to rights.
It was a bourgeois, collectively organized proto-liberal confederacy, which in pursuit of its commercial self-interest resisted the church and the often jealous aristocracy, the blood-determined dynastic tribal hierarchy of electors, grand dukes, landgraves, margraves, and so on.
The Hansa was itself cannily pacific. It preferred diplomacy and economic sanctions to belligerence. It took to arms with reluctance and then only in self-defense. War not only interrupts trade, it's costly. It wastes revenues that might be better spent in the exercise of civic consolidation, in the construction of better cities, in the pursuit of comfort. Still, in what would become the dubious tradition of neutral states, the Hansa was happy to ship weapons. Other people's wars were profitable.
Hansa cities suffered Nazism as a form of internal colonization. That, anyway, is the myth that has been created. Many subsequently found themselves under the yoke of the Soviet Empire for almost half a century. Yet another era, then, to be eradicated by resort to a prouder past. The Hansa was the best thing that ever happened to these cities. It was what made them.
Hitler loathed the Hansa cities in general because they were born of pragmatic materialism and internationalism and were thus deemed un-German. He especially loathed Lübeck because it had forbidden him to canvass there in the 1933 election campaign. The Hansa cities in the GDR were further prohibited from proclaiming their identity under communism, which sought to expunge regional distinctions.
From anywhere, but especially from here, out on the Sound, Hansestad Stralsund has most heartbreakingly beautiful skyline. Is this the Venice of the North?
T. Dan Smith wanted to make Newcastle the Venice of the North. Other Venices of the north are Bruges, Aalborg, Amsterdam, Birmingham, Manchester, the Maryhill area of Glasgow, Mackenzie Town in Inverness. But why should Venice be the measure, the standard? Because it's in the south, which rules our brain because of the PR that travellers have done on its behalf. The number of books devoted to Venice in the past 60 years is 700. The number of books devoted to the Hansa cities is 70. Across the bridge from this Venice of the north is the Rügen, Germany's largest island. One afternoon in the 1990s, I drove here to see the cliffs painted by the greatest of German romantics, Caspar David Friedrich, who was born in Hansestadt Greifswald. It's futile, I know, to visit such sites. The point of art is just that, art. Hardy's Dorset is in his prose, Houseman's Shropshire is in his verse. Cotman's Greta Bridge is mere marks on paper. Friedrich's painting is the mediation of place through mind, a mind touched by mysticism and intimations of sublimity. The place itself could never match its representation. Nonetheless, I ticked the crass Philistine box, and I'm grateful that I did so. I left my car here and walked through the forest towards the cliffs. That afternoon turned out to be, well, epiphany is perhaps overdoing it, but it was a kind of revelation.
This forest was the densest and darkest I'd ever been in. The sky was frequently occluded. The forest floor was barren, save for twigs and leaves and beech nuts. Whatever lives here lives by eternal night. Boughs of beeches stretching to the sky form what can only be described as Gothic vaults. They're cathedral-like. That's a cliché, but so too is a fatality caused by overtaking on a blind bend a cliché. Being a cliché doesn't make it any less terrible. I was, I guess, susceptible to a reversion to the childhood memory of hiding beneath the bedclothes to escape the hideous crones, malevolent trolls, toads, gnomes and evil woodcutters who inhabit forests in fairy tale, the most affecting expression of Gothic literature. Nothing good ever came from broaching a cabin in the wood. My return journey, should I ever get to make it, would be shorter. Return journeys always are.
The Brothers Grimm rendered all children who read their stories German. They gave them German nightmares, German fears. But the fear that overtook me was primal. It went beyond that German conditioning, even though I was in Germany. Brain and body were united in foreboding. It was sufficient to persuade me that another memory might exist, an atavistic memory. I was the distant legatee of some woad-smeared forebear's fear of the forest.
In places like this, reason does not sleep. It's concussed by a heavy blow. So I wouldn't have been surprised to see berserker warriors in bloody fur and skins, or knots in wood mutating into witches' faces, or fabulous stags with shining bezsteins, or enchanting wood sprites whose kiss is fatal. This place seemed to contain an inventory of horrible possibilities.
And it retrospectively prompted the question, why on earth were forests worshipped? Why were certain groups of trees deemed to be sacred groves? Retrospectively, because whatever analytical faculties I possess took industrial inaction.
Then, after a mental eternity, which was probably no more than 30 minutes of the institutionalized lie called clock time, I arrived at the cliffs. I've never in my life been more glad to see a group of men wearing kindergarten leisure wear and beards without moustaches.
I had arrived. Here, literally, was enlightenment. and the Enlightenment, capital C. The Enlightenment was internationalist, cosmopolitan. It dreamed of a universal language, of a world without boundaries and so on. It looked outwards. Yet what Friedrich's painting does not reveal is the forest behind him, behind the figure staring transfixedly at the sea and at a limitless world. For Friedrich, as for the brothers Grimm, forests were places of real and metaphorical darkness which mankind had ceased to dwell in and worship in, which mankind had escaped from, but which still exerted a morbid attraction. An attraction that Friedrich was far from immune to. Friedrich's Baltic Sea, however, is not infected by any such ambiguity. It is not a hostile element. It's a turquoise balm. Friedrich was born in 1774. He belonged to the first German generation to enjoy sea bathing. It was not initially a pleasure, but a health cure, an alternative to taking sulphurous or iodized waters at a wells. Germany abounds in place names prefixed by bad, that is wells or spa. Here again was Germany looking outwards. Sea bathing was an English craze, whose earliest resort, Weymouth, owed its success to its patronage by the royal family, the German royal family.
German resorts developed in a different way to British resorts, and for that matter, to Southern European and Black Sea resorts. They're neither sites of sybaritic flash nor of kiss-me-quick tat. They're not the haunts of sexual predators and their willing quarry. They do not welcome reeking hot dog operatives. They are rather sedate and staid. Perhaps one should say they have not developed. They remain largely true to their origins, which is to say that they're uncomfortable with the pleasure principle, unless, that is, pleasure is to be found in submission to cures and in bodily punishment of a sort that you don't find on the Reeperbahn. They remain devoted to health. This coast was the cradle of modern naturism in the early 20th century. It was a cult of studied asexuality. There's nothing particularly erotic about an entirely naked body. Naturism was, however, political. It was one of a host of reactions to the supposedly deleterious effects of cities upon the mind and the body.
Heinrich Pudor's The Cult of the Nude was the first of many manifestos to make utopian claims from naturism, which might enable its adherents to overcome the awkwardness they felt about their body. This was tied to the cult of youth, to the pursuit of health through gymnastics, dance, vegetarianism, and teetotalism. Naturism was inspired by ancient Greece, particularly by Sparta, where boys were required to relinquish all individualism to the homoerotic militarism of a warrior caste. Spartans may not actually have been so Spartan as the many Germans who took off their clothes to play tug-of-war, hurl medicine balls, and pose fetchingly in modesty pouches of the finest chamois.
The southern Grecian climate is more hospitable to body culture than is the Baltics. Northern nudity is pleasurable only through suffering. It's masochistic, it's punishing, and it's self-deluding. It challenges the body to convince itself that it's exhibiting itself in warm southern climes. Brain, if that's the word, is obliged to overcome shivering brawn.
The triumph of the will persuades its owner that he or she is not suffering goose flesh. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, evidently not a German, but a devotee of Nietzsche, who evidently was, wrote, "Adversity is more vital to man's nature than any artificially induced felicity." But such adversity is artificially induced felicity. This is northern adversity. No, no, no. Let us have some real artificially induced felicity.
Prost. Prost. Auf dein Wohl.
Next time, if I make it, the Hansa Security Consultants, the world's best pasties, totem poles in the forest, and Leonid Brezhnev plays Las Vegas.